Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. This is our annual James Madison lecture. For those of you joining us on C-SPAN, and we're also live casting over our YouTube page right now. We're on the campus of Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. This is where we're holding our summer institute, and we're actually in our classroom building. So we're having a great experience. This ends our second week. We're halfway through of a 4-week summer institute where we're studying the Constitution. I'm Louis Larson. I'm president of the James Madison Foundation. And now I'm going to introduce Guy Burnett, who's director of education and research at our foundation. He'll introduce our speakers and for today's program. Guy?
So thank you very much, President Larson. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Guy Burnett, and I'm the Director of Education and Research here at the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation, as President Larson just announced. I'd like to begin really quickly by introducing the Foundation's Director of Academics, as well as one of the faculty. He's also one of the faculty here at the Summer Institute. He will be engaging in a discussion on a variety of topics related to the founding era with our distinguished James Madison lecturer, who we'll get to in just a bit. Along with his duties at the Foundation, Dr. Morrison is also a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University, and in 2024 through 2025, he will be the visiting professor of politics at the University of Virginia. He's published 5 books on American constitutionalism and is at work on a volume for Cambridge University Press on the political writings of the Reverend John Witherspoon, who was Adams and Franklin's preternaturally active colleague in the Continental Congress. And now I'm honored to introduce our James Madison lecturer this afternoon, distinguished author and Pulitzer Prize winner, Ms. Stacy Schiff. Ms. Schiff is a graduate of Williams College in Massachusetts. She's authored many, many articles for various publications, such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and many others. Ms. Schiff is also the author of 6 books dealing with a wide variety of topics, such as Benjamin Franklin, the Salem witch trials, Cleopatra, and one of my personal favorite historical figures, pilot and author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Her book entitled Vera, Miss Vladimir Nabokov, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2000. Her incredible 2005 book on Benjamin Franklin, which I think most of you have, entitled A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, won the George Washington Book Prize, the Ambassador Award in American Studies, and the Gilbert Chenard Prize. The book was also recently turned into a fantastic miniseries on Apple TV Plus called Franklin, starring Michael Douglas. I think most of you watched that too. Her most recent book, entitled The Revolutionary Samuel Adams, was released in 2022. It won the Colonial Dames of America Book Award and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. It was also named one of the Wall Street Journal's 10 best books of 2022, one of the Los Angeles Times' top 5 nonfiction books of 2022, one of the New York Times' most notable books of 2022, and was also named one of former President Barack Obama's favorite books of 2022. And that's only the beginning of the awards. I could be here for quite a bit longer, but I know we're ready to go. I will now turn the time over to our discussants. Before I do that, there will be time for a brief question and answer period at the end of the lecture. So if you'd like to ask a question, we'll have microphones set up, or at least one microphone right here on my right, your left-hand side. And if you queue up right in front of it, that's perfect. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffry Morrison and our distinguished James Madison lecturer, Ms. Stacy Schiff.
Welcome to you, and thank you very much for being generous with your time and joining us. I'd like to begin, if it's acceptable to you, with a couple of personal questions.
Right to the heart of the matter.
You were born where?
Adams, Massachusetts, which my brother holds to this day was named for John, but he's wrong. It was named for Samuel.
And to college in Massachusetts. You've written 3 books on Massachusetts associated subjects. Your mother was an educator, if I recall. This is a room full of educators. How did her influence on you translate into your career and life?
How many of you spend your time finessing people's sentences? That was my childhood, basically. My mother was a college professor. She taught French and comparative literature. And I'm not sure I ever wrote a sentence of which she approved, about which I'm happy to talk for the next hour, but I think what you'd like to hear about is that basically she was the kind of parent who felt that any essay could bear some improvement, and that any project, the extra credit point must be won, and that any project could benefit from further research. I think this is all her fault, in other words. And she did, my parents bought for me, we were just talking about this among some of you at lunch, those red, white, and blue short biographies for middle school kids, which probably infected me for life. And I think that was partly what made me early on a reader of biography. But more germane to this group, I will admit that only one page of the Samuel Adams biography wrote itself, and that is the dedication page, because the book is dedicated to my 11th grade history teacher. So be careful.
That's a lovely story. Thank you.
She walks around her nursing home showing it to people. It's kind of great.
Well, let's turn to the book, shall we, for a little bit. You're very careful with words. Even more than most writers, you burnish your prose. So let's start with the very first words, if we may. Let's start with the title. It's The Revolutionary. Definite article. I suppose you could have titled it A Revolutionary Life. So what is it about Samuel Adams that made him the revolutionary? More than his cousin John, more than Jefferson, more even than the indispensable man, George Washington. I mean, he doesn't even show up in 1776. He doesn't even have a role in that campy musical. So how could he have been the revolutionary?
Well, that musical doesn't begin in 1764, where I would date the beginnings of Samuel Adams' influence. So to some extent, I think I would answer that question by saying he's the first American politician. Unlike everyone else you just mentioned, Adams only does politics. He does politics day and night. He eats, sleeps, and dreams politics. He is a retail politician of the first order. He has, as many of you already know, a very undistinguished professional life, which is to say that he starts down several paths and fails at each one, manages to squander 1,000 pounds. He has an astonishingly high burnout rate for any kind of career in business of any kind. But he is utterly, he gives himself utterly to ideas, and the ideas to which he gives himself ultimately become the ideas on which the revolution is founded. So that is part of the reason I say this. In terms of crystallizing first principles, galvanizing a population, basically broadcasting propaganda, he has no equal. So in that sense, in the sense of inciting, or at least encouraging and fostering, Adams is the man, as his contemporaries all say of him. And that was partly what got me started down this road, was Thomas Jefferson, for example, calling him the earliest, the most active, the most persevering of the patriots. And the definite article is in each one of those descriptions. When John Adams talks about him, he talks about him as the man of the hour. He is the Massachusetts politician, and he is, the most incendiary Bostonian in the most incendiary town in the most incendiary colony. So that bears some, that's where the distinction to me is founded. But I should also add a little postscript, which is to say that the author doesn't necessarily write the title of her book, the publisher does. And this was meant, you can't see it on the jacket, but there's a ghostly colon between the words The Revolutionary and the words Samuel Adams. And the title really is The Revolutionary Samuel Adams. So.
I see. Well, you did write the first sentence of the book, I take it.
I did, all by myself.
Title, so I'd like to go there, if you'll allow it. This is a book filled with quotable sentences, and the very first one gets us off to the races. Samuel Adams delivered what may count as the most remarkable second act in American life. I thought, Ulysses Grant? Not quite. Harry the Haberdasher Truman? Not quite. It's really on the point, I think, Samuel Adams. The most remarkable second act in American life. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, and I should just back up and say that although that is the first line of the book, it's one of the last lines I wrote because, I don't know about you, I write my introductions after I've written the book. So for me, the first line of the book is what is to you the first line of the second chapter, because my publisher doesn't believe that anyone ever reads the introduction, so he labels the introduction chapter 1. And that is, so really the book begins with Paul Revere's ride, to my mind. And it goes back to really what I was hinting at when I say Adams sort of flames out early in life. He has 2 degrees from Harvard. His family has every expectation that he will be either a successful minister or a successful lawyer or a successful businessman. To each of those professions, he gives a few minutes of his time and moves on. And ultimately really doesn't come out of the shadows. He essentially plays a role in various minor town of Boston posts in the years leading up to the 1760s. He at one point manages to lose what little money he had left with friends in running a newspaper. But he really doesn't come out of the shadows until the Sugar and Stamp Acts, at which point he really kind of flames into full glory. And I guess that's my sense of that first act, where he's hard to find. We talked a little bit about sourcing. It's very hard to find traces of him except in court, which was not unusual for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where people were very litigious. So often you find them more easily in court than you do elsewhere. But the traces of those early years are fairly rare. After the 1760s, you hear him loud and clear. And so he really is brought to the stage as his arch nemesis, Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, and then the governor of Massachusetts will make clear. He's brought to the fore by really the Stamp Act, which plants him in the House of Representatives in Massachusetts, and then doesn't really fall out of the spotlight until really mid-revolution, when he's in Congress for a very long time, less and less effectively. So that's really the second act to which I'm referring in that sentence.
Let me quote Esther Forbes, if I may, whose career you have emulated in very interesting ways. Both of you born and bred in Massachusetts. Both of you began your careers as editors. Both of you won a Pulitzer Prize. Maybe another one is on the horizon for you with this Franklin book, who knows. Both of you wrote about the witches in Salem. But here's what Esther Forbes said in her own Pulitzer Prize winner, Paul Revere and the World He Lived In, 1942, a book that I think can be read with profit today. Most American heroes of the Revolutionary period are by now 2 men, the actual man and the romantic image. Some are even 3 men, the actual man, the image, and the debunked remains. How did Samuel Adams manage to elude the debunkers? Almost every other founder has been debunked to one degree or another, but Adams, the revolutionary, has somehow eluded the debunkers. What do you think?
Well, he got a beer, which is better than the rest of them, right? I mean, Adams is, and I should go back half a step here and say that what made Adams so immensely effective and what made him so immensely popular is that he's a very recessive character and very much a team player. And a lot of his ability to solidify and galvanize political forces was his willingness to either hand on responsibility or to himself take a step back and let someone else occupy center stage, a strategy that worked particularly well if John Hancock or John Adams was your associate, as was the case here. So Adams is half a step behind the curtain and most comfortable behind the curtain. And because that's where he locates himself, he's a little harder to pull onto center stage and therefore a little harder to mythologize, and therefore you don't need to debunk him. It makes the biographer's life entirely miserable because you're looking for him almost in the reverse image, almost in the after image that he leaves. He's left the room and someone else will write about him. And then what happens is at the end of his life, John Adams, for example, his second cousin and a younger man, will say to Samuel, could you please, for posterity's sake, collect your papers? Your papers will themselves explain better than any other set of documents the revolution to posterity. Could you please at least publish them? And Samuel Adams never does it. And part of my suspicion, I don't have an answer on this one, my suspicion is in part he doesn't do that because of his recessive nature. He's a very demure person, in fact, despite the propagandizing and the arm twisting. And part of that is that his faith plays an enormous role in his life, and he believes that he answers to one judge and one judge alone, and that judge is not posterity, which is not, for example, how John Adams played his cards. So there's a certain sense there of his broadcasting really, his doing this really out of noble and selfless reasons and not feeling he had to broadcast to the 21st century. Another reason why he makes his biographer miserable. And I should also say that there is a certain amount of ill will created about him after his death, largely thanks to John Hancock. And that both demeans him and pushes him off what little stage he already did occupy. And that too, I think, has pushed him to the wings. So there are a great number of reasons. I also think if you are fomenting revolution, it is your job to cover your trail. So there's a lot of destroyed paper, there are a lot of fires. There's no scene in this book with which I had more trouble than the scene of John Adams and Samuel Adams in Philadelphia at the Congress, where Samuel Adams is feeding his papers to the fire because, as he explains to John, he doesn't want any of their Confederates to suffer for his negligence. And that's the record we want, and it's gone. So a certain amount of this is him covering his own trail, which we then have a very hard time, I think, recovering. And if it were not for those claims by his contemporaries, I think we would have lost sight of him completely.
As I recall, you have another scene related to the burning when it's such a hot day, I think, that he can't bear to have a fire, and instead he cuts up the papers into minuscule little bits, confetti-like, and then throws them out the window.
This is not what the biographer wants to hear. No, this is like how to kill the biographer.
Well, I used that word elude a few moments ago, and I'd like to take these out of order, actually, because of something you said. So how was the elusive Samuel Adams involved in two of the most iconic events of the Revolution, at least in Massachusetts? The Boston Massacre, the Bloody Massacre, as it's denominated in Paul Revere's famous cartoon, or woodcut, I suppose what it is. And then what we call the Boston Tea Party, and I learned from you that that's not really the name by which it went at the time. It's the destruction of the tea, something, by the way, that George Washington disapproved of.
As did Ben Franklin.
Yeah. So tell us about the elusive Samuel Adams and how he, puppet master-like, was helping to orchestrate and then propagandize these events.
I guess the word we would use today in both cases is packaging. Both of these events come down to us largely packaged by Samuel Adams. The very words bloody massacre are Samuel Adams's. Hutchinson was, who at that time is acting governor, is extremely annoyed by the fact that he keeps repeating those. It isn't effective. Most of you have the Paul Revere image in your mind, by the way. So everything pretty much about that image is fictitious, including the words bloody massacre, if you assume that, 5 casualties is not necessarily a massacre. We don't know where Samuel Adams is that night, and we think if he was with John, we know where he was, but otherwise we don't know where he was that night. Where he is over the subsequent weeks and months is abundantly clear, because it is he who seems to get to Paul Revere before Paul Revere makes his engraving, which in fact is a copy of someone else's engraving.
But in fact, he was sued, wasn't he? I think Paul Revere was actually sued.
It's an early case of sort of copyright infringement. But it's Adams who helps to further the narrative that the customs commissioners, who were then very controversially in Boston, had something to do with this ugly event. And so Paul Revere inserts into that etching several traces of the customs commissioners. He has the customs house, he has a musket coming out of the house. As you remember, he has the soldiers kind of looking menacing and advancing in formation against this huddle of martyred-seeming Bostonians, which include a woman. There was certainly no woman in the streets of Boston that night. The whole thing is essentially packaged for British consumption. And to London, Adams is instrumental in sending some 96 depositions of people from that evening. An interesting thing, if you read through them, is that everyone was there and everyone saw something completely different. I mean, even the position of the moon is different in some of these accounts. But his point was he needed to get the report of this violence in the streets, which he had been dreading and warning of since 1768 when troops arrived, to London as quickly as possible, because of course martyred Boston needed to get the attention. There should not be any interest whatsoever in what might have provoked this outburst on the part of the soldiers, who were deeply provoked, by the way, and were pelted with things that evening, as you know, by the populace of Boston. So Adams has, for a year and a half before the massacre, been writing these very tendentious pieces very lurid pieces about the crimes and the misdemeanors of the soldiers who are posted to Boston, warning that something dreadful may happen. And then, not surprisingly, there is this combustive moment. So part of the role he plays is in packaging it. Part of the role he plays, and it's a very canny role, is in making sure that it is not forgotten. So let me skip over the trials for a minute. He will be instrumental in organizing what's called a sermon that is delivered every year to commemorate the Boston Massacre. And it's delivered every year up until the point when the 4th of July becomes a holiday. And it's a deeply moving, usually very theatrical performance. It is broadcast throughout all of the colonies, and it is a highly fictionalized version of what happened that night and the blood that ran in the streets. A very lachrymose production, usually given by a very gifted orator, a friend of Adams's, hand-picked, done with enormous theatrical values. So there's the maximum amount of propaganda being eked out of this evening. The trials, as many of you know, are interesting in that John Adams is probably hand-picked by Samuel Adams for the defense. And John Adams manages to see to it that everyone except 2 of the soldiers are exonerated. The trials are something that Samuel Adams had hoped would take place very quickly while tempers are still flaring, while the town is still aflame. Thomas Hutchinson manages to delay them until the fall of 1770, so 6 months after the massacre. It's March to October, 6 months, I think so. And then after the soldiers are exonerated, after John Adams has worked his exquisite courtroom magic, Samuel Adams will then relitigate the entire trials in the Boston Gazette over a number of months, basically pointing fingers at all of the British crimes, all of the British events which he now claims were by no means innocent moments, but were in fact deeply troubled in terms of the trials. So he's keeping this right in the fore of everyone's minds, even after the town of Boston has been exhausted, and it seems as if there is closure on the trials. With the Boston Tea Party, it's a slightly different story in that we know precisely where Samuel Adams was when the tea hurls itself into Boston Harbor. And that is because he is largely, it seems, in charge of the town meetings. How many of you teach this, I should ask? So the town meetings which are being held in Boston to decide what to do with this noxious cargo that has arrived and how can it be held off, how can it possibly be sent back despite customs restrictions. It's Adams who's in charge of those meetings. And as things become more and more tense and it becomes more and more clear that there's not going to be a permit issued to allow the ships to return to London, it's Adams who's really sort of behind the scenes, it would seem, helping to coordinate this highly choreographed destruction of the tea. It's basically always referred to as the destruction of the tea until the 19th century. It's basically like the recent unpleasantness. Nobody wants to really call it what it is. Adams turns it into a noble defense of liberties after the fact, as opposed to a senseless, an unlawful destruction of personal property, of private property. It's really he afterwards who will package it, but he is really intent on that moment on something happening. And the only hint we have as to how much he's involved with the actual destruction is a tiny hint in a letter he sends to his most faithful London correspondent about 3 weeks before, in which he says if there isn't some movement on the London front, he will next be writing about a non-trifling event, and that non-trifling event would seem to be the destruction of the tea. He has in that time established the committees of correspondence, which I don't want to go on about, but it is through Adams's 1772 committees of correspondence that the news of the destruction of the tea and the reasons for the destruction of the tea is disseminated throughout the colonies. And it's really the first kind of colony-wide effort. He's trying to bring everyone together on the same page. And if you read through the responses from the committees in the other towns of New England in particular to Boston, in the wake of the destruction, you see this extraordinary unanimity of vocabulary and sentiment. And I would say that that's probably one of Adams's greatest deeds, is that he has been able to bring everyone somehow to the same page with the same ideas, using the same words. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
Well, I want to make it even longer, actually, if I may. So can we return to the massacre just for a moment? I said earlier you're careful with words, and even on the fly, evidently. Lachrymose. You talked about those lachrymose speakers that Samuel Adams helps to line up for the anniversaries. One of them was Joseph Warren in 1775, I think it's Joseph Warren. And one of our faculty pointed out that year he showed up in a toga virilis, and gave the oration, and no one laughed because they were so impressed with and respectful of Roman virtues. And so perhaps we can move from that to Samuel Adams's frequent invocation of the Romans and the Spartans in particular. We've also, not only are these educators, these are graduate students in the audience, and they've been enjoying or suffering through 2 weeks now of lectures from our faculty on things like classical republicanism and Enlightenment liberalism and Protestant Christianity. And it occurs to me that the first and the third of those are especially embodied by Samuel Adams. And for instance, he's forever talking of Roman virtues, and especially Spartan virtues. In fact, one of his most curious lines is that he hoped Boston would become a, quote, Christian Sparta. This is in a letter he writes in 1780. What would he have meant by such a thing?
Well, that letter, I think that's a December letter, right? So that's he's not responding to the 4th of July. He's responding to something, there was some sort of pageantry, right? There was some kind of celebration of which he radically disapproved. And the reason he radically disapproved was not because he was a killjoy at all, but because he had a very deep-seated allergy to any kind of frivolity and any kind of dissipation. And basically, as did every other founder, felt that a republic stood on two pillars. One was virtue and moral probity, and the other was education. And without those two, you could not essentially have a republic. And the education piece, it did not seem something I think that he worried about at the time. I think he felt there was great strides being made. Girls began to be educated in Samuel Adams's day in Massachusetts, which was to his great delight. The moral probity thing, he was not, at the end of his life in particular, he was not pleased with what he was seeing. And this is part of the reason why he and Hancock so disagree. Adams feels very much that sober Republican virtues are the only way to run a country. Anything that reeks of dissolution or of luxury or of, for that matter, ambition rubs him the wrong way. And I mean, he's not the only founder who feels this way. I mean, Ben Franklin on Diligence in Industry is literally a monotone, all the way through the life. But this feeling that that finery and frippery were in some way inconsistent with the morals to which he committed himself is very strong with Samuel Adams. There's a very strong Calvinist streak here, and it carries him all the way through his life. It's particularly a difficult thing for him in the post-war years when the country is racing toward this opulent commercial future, and he is still harking back to what he refers to as the ancient purity of principles. And he really sees the two really at odds, and that's really where that remark comes from.
That's very helpful, thank you. And it helps to explain his antipathy toward Hancock, a dandy. Just look at any portrait of Hancock, and he's decked out in all of that finery. And Samuel Adams, you have a wonderful little passage where you say he shows up at the Continental Congress in a suit that he'd been wearing for how long? For weeks, I think.
Yeah.
He just was alarmingly unconcerned about his personal appearance and more Spartan, I suppose one might say. May I read the whole quote, the whole line? And you're exactly right. This is a letter, December 30th, 1780, that he writes to John Scalay, and he reveals some of his personality in a couple of letters to that recipient. Well, here's what Samuel Adams wrote. I love the people of Boston. I once thought that city would be the Christian Sparta, but alas, will men never be free? They will be free no longer than while they remain virtuous. Sidney tells us, Algernon Sidney, there are times when people are not worth saving. meaning when they have lost their virtue. I pray God this may never be truly said of my beloved town. So I think you're absolutely right. You can hear, it's a lament. My once virtuous town has been corrupted somehow or other. It's almost like a Jeremiad sermon, pronouncing a kind of curse on Boston for its straying from the path of virtue and righteousness.
I think the only thing that disturbed him quite as much was a sense of hereditary distinction, which is something else that he shares, I guess you would say, with Franklin. But this feeling that the Hutchinsons of Massachusetts, the Olivers, had a very tight lock on power, and that when one of them was done with a position, he would hand it off to his cousin or his uncle, was as deeply offensive to him as was this propensity toward luxury, which needed to be nipped in the bud at all times. And he sees that happening again after the war as well. And those are his two, bugbears.
Yeah, luxury, you're absolutely right to zero in on that. To us, luxury is a good word. We all want a luxury vehicle. We all want a Lexus rather than a Toyota, yeah? But the Latin word luxus meant a kind of excessive luxury. It was a vice. And Samuel Adams, that Roman, Spartan Christian, it just raised his hackles whenever he saw it. Can we continue with the religion theme for a little bit?
Sure.
It's one of the many things I think are deftly handled in the book. And can we turn to his second cousin John for a moment? This is a line that I'm sure almost all of us in this room have heard before, and probably you have taught. And it shows up in some otherwise very fine studies of the American Revolution, but it's usually truncated. A period is often inserted where actually that sentence continues. What do we mean by the American Revolution? This is Adams writing many years later, John, 1818. What do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. Now that's what you probably know, and you probably have read that with a period there and a closed quotation. But he goes on, John goes on. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. So would you be willing to talk just a little bit more about how Samuel Adams's neo-Puritanism influenced him, maybe even affected his political thought in ways that it didn't quite with his second cousin John, because John, I think, left the faith, and Samuel was still within the pale. By the time John Adams is in late middle age, he's writing to his adult son, John Quincy Adams, about, quote, the blasphemy of the doctrine of the Incarnation. But Samuel, I think, remained that Calvinist, sort of neo-Puritan to his dying day. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think that the difference in age largely accounts for this. And I want to go back to sort of Adams in his earlier years, before he becomes the failure he becomes in his early career. The years that he's just over a decade older than his cousin John, and also just about the same amount older than John Hancock. And the Harvard curriculum at this point is really a fusion of sort of the ideas of John Locke and the ideas of John Calvin. And that was a slightly different curriculum from the curriculum that John Adams and John Hancock would have been delivered to the two of them. And if you look back, and this was it's very hard to sort of fill in someone's intellectual formation when you have no documentation. And the way I somewhat did it with this book was to go back to look at what the master's theses at Harvard were during the years that Samuel Adams was there, because it tells you what the preoccupations of the student body were, and often you can see how many people are ending up on the same subject. And when Samuel Adams is there, the ideas are still, to a large extent, religious. Very quickly thereafter, they become more general and then more political. It's very unusual. Adams's thesis question was an interesting one. It was, do we owe allegiance to the king if the republic cannot? Should allegiance to the king trump the health of the republic?
Whether it be lawful to resist the supreme magistrate if the commonwealth cannot be otherwise preserved.
which was a very odd question to be asking in 1740 before that question is really on anyone's radar, and not a question anyone would ask again for quite a few years. The religious piece of this, there were people who were writing on, were you going to meet angels in heaven? Was the Pope the Antichrist? Do vegetables breathe? There were fascinating questions, but a lot of them, some of them were the questions we ask today: is capital punishment justified? Do the ends justify the means? But a lot of these questions were deeply religious questions. They were questions of what we would consider doctrine. Adams was still of the generation where if you were a leading intellectual, you became a minister. His parents assumed he would become a minister, as did Ben Franklin's parents, who did not go to Harvard or college for that matter. So, there is this sort of sense of the world changing in those years, but Adams is also a man of very deep faith. And, I'm the 90 millionth person to point out that there is a parallel here between the sense of a church without bishops and the sense of a country without a king. I mean, there's a very honest overlay between his Puritan ideals and where republicanism comes in. This is a very anti-hierarchical, egalitarian sense, and Adams really lives that sense completely. And to your point about the lack of luxury, he's able to make his point, I think, all the more loudly, all the more eloquently by his very poverty, by the fact that he has no money, somehow seems to exist on air, doesn't put any emphasis whatsoever on his wardrobe or his lodging, much to his family's dismay, no doubt, but he's a man who seems to just live on ideas, and that gives him a certain advantage, I think, in terms of being taken seriously and heard seriously, because he seems to some extent to be commingling his faith with his politics.
Can I make a suggestion? And far be it from me to contradict you. You write books, I write books. Your books are read by millions, mine are read by dozens. But let me just make a
That means I get more bad reviews than you do, is what that
general
means.
suggestion, because it's something that has come up in a number of our lectures. And could it be that thesis of his, that Harvard thesis about the lawfulness of resisting a supreme magistrate if there's no other way to preserve the Commonwealth, might in fact be derived from a lot of Protestant Huguenot, for example, resistance literature that had been produced beginning in the 16th century by people. Well, his cousin John refers to one of those, the Vindicii contra Tyrannus, almost certainly written by a French Huguenot. We're not sure of his name. In fact, John says this is one of the most influential tracts in kind of ginning up resistance to the British. Is it possible that maybe Samuel sees that thesis not merely as a secular one, but one that has some kind of religious Calvinist overtones, that he's drawing upon some of this Calvinistic resistance literature in that?
It's possible. Here we're at a complete loss for documentation. So it's very hard to see. I mean, when John Adams first meets his older cousin Samuel, they don't seem to have known each other until the 1760s, or late 1750s. He's completely starstruck by Samuel Adams, John. And one of the things he mentions is his deep erudition. He thinks his cousin is immensely well-read. John probably leaves us the best descriptions we have of Samuel Adams because he doesn't talk about him as this kind of blowhard or this killjoy, but as a man of enormous charisma and a man who's very gentle, who's of refined manners and steadfast policy. But it's a very different Samuel Adams, I think, from the cartoon version. But he does mention always his erudition and his reading. We don't have Samuel Adams's, we have some of John Adams's library, we don't have Samuel Adams's library. So it's very hard to figure out, except from references he makes in his writing. And the good news is there's a tremendous amount of newspapering, which we didn't really even talk about, but he's writing assiduously through these years under under more pseudonyms than I've been able to count. And in those, interlaced into those writings, you do see an enormous amount of both scripture and of books about religion.
All right. You said earlier that you didn't want to talk very much about the committees of correspondence.
I just think people hear those three words and they immediately go to sleep. But this might be a different audience.
Can I nudge you to do it?
Sure.
And for one reason, because it strikes me as oddly enough, one of the most contemporary They're like
It's Twitter.
social media.
It's Twitter,
exactly.
yeah,
They're
it's
like
Twitter.
these
He invented
social media
Twitter. That's what your takeaway is.
webs or networks. And he really is the motive force, isn't he,
Yeah.
behind these
Yes.
committees of correspondence. My John Witherspoon was the head of the one in New Jersey. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about those?
So essentially, Adams has had this idea, and he's not alone in this for years, that the colonies need to make common cause, that there has to be some communication among the colonies. And obviously, in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, for example, you have this sense of everyone needs to ally themselves with poor martyred Boston. Boston is the only town that's been occupied by troops. The other colonies have no sense of this. He wants them to understand Boston's suffering and to make common league. And he reaches out at various points to correspondents in different places, first of all in Rhode Island, to see if he can get other colonies on the same page. The effort never really gets off the ground until 1772, late in the year, when finally he is able to begin with what he terms, and I feel as if he chose the name because it's so soporific, these committees of correspondence. They sound very vanilla and they sound very unobjectionable. It's like, who could object to a Son of Liberty, right? Who could object to a committee of correspondence? And the idea simply was to have these committees of men in every hamlet in New England and ultimately throughout the colonies who would agree upon the rights and principles of the colonists, who would note the invasions of those rights, and who would broadcast them to each other. It sounds like a very simple assignment. Thomas Hutchinson, who, when Adams first gets the idea off the ground, thinks it's ludicrous, makes a resounding speech in defense of Parliament's rights over the colonies in January of 1773. The minute Thomas Hutchinson makes that, kind of overreaches in this very draconian speech, the committees of correspondence begin popping up like crazy throughout New England. So it is, in a funny way, once again, through British overreach, that this kind of proto-terrorist cell, this network that Adams has kind of single-handedly got off the ground, begins to thrive. And by the end of the year, when that tea lands in the harbor, these committees are in full operation. And they will ultimately be what bring together the first Congresses, what bring all the colonies to the same page. And it starts out with this just kind of what seems to be this kind of half-cracked idea of we just need to state the rights of the colonists and where those begin and where London's rights over us end.
Thank you. That was hardly soporific.
I'm asleep.
We're all awake, aren't we? Wide awake. Well, I've been signaled that we're coming to the end. We're not quite at the end of our discussive portion, but I don't want to leave it without bringing Ben Franklin into the conversation. And it occurs to me that there are some similarities between those two men. They are both Boston natives, though they are born a full generation apart. Franklin could easily have been the father of Samuel Adams, chronologically speaking. They're both men of the word. They are good with words. They both begin as printers, don't they? And Samuel Adams does some printing, a little bit of newspaper
Hangs out in
work.
print shops. We'll give him that.
Hangs out in print shops.
Probably got dirt on his hands, got ink on his hands, yeah.
All right, I'll take that qualification. So what is it that they have in common? What do they have that separates them? And how do they sort of rank as revolutionaries in your mind? We already know Samuel occupies the first rank, but how would you just sort of talk about the relationship between those two and the features of their careers that are striking to you? Obviously, you were interested in both of them enough to write books about them.
We have 3 hours left, right?
Yeah, it's a little like asking you to reduce the ox to a boyark.
I feel like I just got the compare and contrast question.
Sorry.
So I should go back and say that, start by saying that it's unclear to me when the two of them actually meet for the first time. For a very long time, as you know, Benjamin Franklin is for all of these years in London. And he is, for part of these years, he is the Massachusetts representative in London. To the mind of Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin is also insufficiently revolutionary. He's understood to be very much in the thrall to the administration, possibly someone who considers himself a future royal governor of Massachusetts. There's a certain distrust on Samuel Adams's part of Ben Franklin. I don't think that they meet. It's possible they meet before. I don't think they meet until the first Congress. at which point they, let me go back a half a step from there. There's an inadvertent, there's a relationship between the two of them, which I have no idea if anyone's ever pointed out before. Franklin, as many of you know, through some means that is still obscure to us today, lifted some papers from a desk in London and had them sent back to Boston, where they were published, to deleterious effect for Thomas Hutchinson and the administration. It's unclear to us where he got those papers, but and he ultimately did not reveal his source. But when he is called before the authorities in London for having stolen these letters, it is several days after London has received word of the destruction of the tea. So what happens to Franklin that day in the cockpit is that he is utterly, he's torn to shreds by Wedderburn, the British Solicitor General. And it is very shortly after that moment that Franklin goes from being someone who really would like, if he can possibly do so, to hold together this brilliant empire, this China vase, this noble China vase, as he calls it, to becoming a revolutionary, to feeling that the colonies have been traduced by the administration and by feeling very much like an American rather than a Briton. So Samuel Adams, in a funny way, has delivered Franklin to the sides of the revolutionaries. And Franklin is only on his way back to America when Lexington and Concord occur, and does not arrive in America until afterwards. They probably then first meet at that first Congress. It is very hard, as you all know, to get the colonies all on the same page at this point in terms of making some kind of forceful declaration of independence. And at one point, Adams and Franklin are kind of in cahoots, where they have agreed that if the Middle Atlantic states won't concur, Franklin and the New England states will kind of go off together. So there's clearly an affinity between the two of them, and a sense behind the scenes that the two of them are firmer on the subject of independence than are most people. And that there's a rapport between the two of them. As writers go, I don't think that anyone wrote as brilliantly and as effortlessly as Benjamin Franklin. I mean, Adams issues anthem after anthem to American rights and to American, to the rights and the privileges of the colonies and to America's future. But Franklin, there's a world in every letter of Ben Franklin's. The letters are just utterly gorgeous. And I think that if you're looking at them in terms of who is the greater intellectual, who has the greater breadth of field, Adams is monomaniacal, which is what makes him effective. Franklin is encyclopedic, which is his secret success, I would say.
All right, very good. Well, you're a good sport, and thank you so much
for
that discussion. And now we will turn to the question and answer portion. And as was indicated earlier, we have a stationary microphone up front here. And please queue up, make your way to that, and have your questions at the ready. I don't think in this audience I have to remind you that these are to be interrogatories and not declarative statements. You'll have questions, I know, so please queue up for them.
Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Sierra. I'm a fellow from Texas. And my question is, you have such fascinating characters that you're portraying. How do you choose the topics that you dive into? For example, like looking so closely at Franklin and his time in Paris.
I wish I had the answer to that question, because it would make my life and my publisher's life so much easier. As you may have noticed, I seem to have a kind of like professional ADD. I'm a little bit all over. I think there's a kind of subterranean relationship among the books. Usually you're trying to solve for a question that I think is probably that nowhere figures in the ultimate book, in fact. This book largely fell out of the previous book, which was about the Salem witch trials. And one of the burning questions in that year, in 1692, when basically the eastern part of Massachusetts is in the grip of this frightful delusion, is how does it end? And who finally is willing and able to raise a hand and say, this is lunacy. This is going to become a stain on American history, which are actually the words that are used at the time. It was an extremely unpopular thing to say, and it was a dangerous thing to say, because if you cast any aspersions on the doings of the witchcraft court, you generally were rewarded with an accusation of witchcraft. So the first objections are made very quietly, anonymously, often only orally, in which case we don't have much except hints of them. But one of the first people to weigh in was a Bostonian named Thomas Brattle, who was Anglican, not a part of the establishment, very wealthy in his own right, had nothing to lose, had less to lose than most people. And he reminded me on some level of Samuel Adams. And I think I was looking for that kind of moral compass. Who's the person who in an emergency like that is going to pull the switch? And on some level, I thought I was writing about somebody else, and I'm going like this because I would go into the research library where I work, and I would go that way, and then by the end of the afternoon, I would be this way, reading the papers of Samuel Adams.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a fellow from New Jersey. My question is, what was the experience like of having one of your books adapted for television, and the experience of kind of going through the process and how it was, put together for TV?
So I'm trying to think what the analogy would be to like watching one of your children at Halloween is kind of what it comes to. You have to say, that's not my child, that's a vampire, right? This was a particularly, from the get-go, this was a surprisingly and I'm sure uniquely blessed project in the sense that the producers were enormously talented and very open. The writers were ridiculously talented and very open. Everybody got along. There was this real spirit of camaraderie. They included me in every step. And at a certain point, I realized, you know what? It's your baby. It's your vampire, right? It's not mine. And I knew that no more feedback from me was necessary. It was really important, obviously, to me that historically it not be embarrassing or that it be accurate on some level. Did Temple almost go off on this mission to invade the coast of England? Yes. Did Franklin want him to go as Lafayette's aide de camp? Yes. Did it happen in the way it happens in this series? Not so much. So that it was important to me that the structure be respected and that the historical events be accurate. Obviously, we don't have dialogue, and that's where you have to hope it's going to work out okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Will Kelly. I'm the fellow from Tennessee. You were mentioning in your answer to Wendy a moment ago, you originally looked at somebody else's papers and it drew you to Sam Adams. In telling a story, there's always things you have to cut, people you have to cut out. Was there somebody in particular who got cut out of this story just for time and continuity's sake that you wish you could have kept in or done more about? And I'd kind of like just sort of hear the reasons why.
I think with every book, there is a minor character or a supporting actor who steals the narrative. And I'm thinking more when I say this of Cleopatra, where no matter what you do, Cicero always said it better. And Cicero wrote voluminously, and obviously we have a lot more of Cicero than we have of Cleopatra. So I felt like he was always stealing the narrative, and I had to kind of hack him back. And the Cicero of this book, unsurprisingly, was John Adams, who always said it better, usually said it in a vaguely petulant way, so you really wanted to quote it, and was on the scene most of the time. For example, the trip to the first Congress, we know from John Adams's account, who basically talks about how the temperature changes as these men leave New England and they hit the middle Atlantic states and people are a little bit less receptive to them, and they're warned that the South sees you guys as a bunch of Goths and Vandals, as it's put, as a bunch of hot-headed fanatics. You're going to need to temper your statements when you get there. And they meet sort of all the dignitaries along the way. We don't have a word of any of this from Samuel Adams, who never left us an aesthetic note in any of his letters. But John didn't miss a single detail. So I would say I had to cut back stringently on John Adams, for whom, believe it or not, I have a certain affection. Because he kept kind of trying to steal the narrative.
Now, my name is Idel Corey, and I'm one of the oldest fellows. I was awarded the fellowship in 2005. I'm from South Carolina, and I know a lot of these people. Can you agree, or can you confirm, if Adams believed that self-governance cannot happen without self-governance? Would he agree with that statement?
Self-governance without self?
Without self-governance. Self-governance cannot happen without self-governance.
Absolutely would have agreed with you. In very much the sense that we're talking about, in the sense that there's a definite austerity of spirit here, and a definite sense of, selfless public service in the first case. And in the second case, if you do not have the ability to govern the self, you do not have the ability to govern a republic. This was his problem to some extent with John Hancock.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lindsay McBride from Wisconsin, and I was just wondering, as a female scholar, what it's like in that field, but then also writing about men in the Revolutionary era.
Wow. I think it bothers me that more women don't write about revolutionary figures. If you look at the shelf, it's a largely male shelf. I'm not sure I think about gender all that much when I'm actually working. I'm not sure I would ever read a book and think, oh, this is a woman's take, or this is a man's take on the 18th century. I think that there has been a certain kind of force field around the major figures that has kept women away for years, with the possible exception of Barbara Tuchman or Catherine Drinker Bowen before her. But I like to think that's being broken down now. I think I'm more attentive if a woman ever came within 50 meters of Samuel Adams, she's in the book. I think I'm more attentive to the women than maybe someone else would be, but maybe that's just now all of us would be a little more attentive to the women. I mean, it is interesting if you go back and you read earlier biographies of John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or whatever, it is interesting obviously to see how that narrative has changed. I mean, did it take Annette to be able to talk about Sally Hemings properly after X number of men had written about Jefferson? I mean, I don't know how I would weigh that. I think we're all a little bit more, obviously a little more open-minded and open-eyed about what we're writing about. I'm not sure I would argue that a female biographer, though, brings anything more to the task than does a male biographer. I'll get back to you if I can think of a reason there.
Hello, my name is Jesse Perez, also a fellow from Wisconsin. I just wanted to know a little bit about your process and sort of working yourself up to talk about some of these daunting founding figures, because in many ways, I think to myself, man, it would take a ton of confidence just to feel, qualified to speak on them. So can you talk a little bit about your process and sort of when you feel like you've learned enough about these people and their stories and their history to actually start to put pen to paper and actually write down the stories of who they are?
That's such a great question. I usually do about 3 or 4 years of research before I start to write. Most of my fellow biographers are smarter than that, and they start to write before they have done all the research. I will usually get to a point where I've written X number of pages or chapters, and I realize there's something I forgot to research. And I have to stop and go back, or a new archive will appear, and I have to stop and go back into the archive and research something. The short answer to your question about when I have the confidence, never. Even after I've written the book, perhaps. But there does become a point where the material starts to speak to you, and you start to see where it begins, and you begin to see certain themes emerging, and you realize that scene's going to be essential. And here's how you're going to be able to, for example, here's how you're going to be able to get through Samuel Adams's childhood, for which we have no material. Here's how you can actually hang that on what was happening in Boston in the 1730s and the 1740s. I like to have all the material because I feel as if I don't know what the book is about until I have all the material. And then there does come, as I say, the sort of marinating moment where you get so excited about the material, you realize you actually have to write. And something else that helps with that is a publisher's deadline. Because then suddenly you realize, wait, I don't get money until I send in pages, and that's very motivating. But you like to think that a year or so before that, you're going to get to that point where you're going to see, the material's beginning to burble, and you're beginning to sort of see how things speak to each other. I know with the Franklin book, I always knew where it began, but I also knew I had an enormous cast of characters. Franklin lands in Paris in 1776. He's the most celebrated man in town. And there are spies, there are colleagues, there are French officials, everybody has an unpronounceable name, and I was going to have to somehow cut through all of that and keep the focus on Franklin. And I remember writing the initial pages and feeling kind of stuck because I knew too much in a way. And I would also say, I don't know if this rings bells with any of you, but sometimes a little bit of amnesia is helpful. Sometimes letting some of it go can be very helpful because the larger picture emerges and you don't get lost in the forest of details.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Carioli, and I'm the fellow from Maine. I was just going to ask, as someone from New England, there's this reputation in the Revolutionary period of virtue in New England, and earlier you called Massachusetts a martyr. So I was just wondering, what constitutes Massachusetts as a martyr and kind of gives New England this reputation of virtue, in your opinion?
The virtue thing is very closely tied to to Puritanism, the sense that these were, as the South saw, hot-headed fanatics. The Salem witch trials leave a very large stain even on these years. And interestingly, when you go back and look at the literature, the number of references in the 1760s and the 1770s to Salem is shocking because people think the people are now deluded, or the naysayers, the loyalists, say the people are now deluded the way they were in 1692. It's 1692 all over again, says Thomas Hutchinson. People are just, they've completely lost the narrative here. But that sense of the bedrock of virtue on which New England is founded, this bedrock of Puritanism, is really where that piece comes from. The martyrdom is just about the fact that in 1768, which is, I think, far earlier than most of us remember, troops march into Boston. I mean, that's an astonishing moment. Nobody believes these troops are actually going to arrive. Everyone is braced for how will Boston react to being occupied by redcoats. And if you actually look at what is happening between the soldiers and the citizens in those months, aside from the stuff that Adams is making up for the newspapers, you see the town of Boston really being very hard on these soldiers. They are called every possible name. Things are thrown at them. People steal their guns. They're harassed at every moment. So not a town of great virtue in that sense, but there is a sense that they are beleaguered and oppressed in a way that no other colony is at that point. And then, of course, that narrative becomes easier in the wake of the Boston Massacre, which is a narrative that Samuel Adams propagates for the next years.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Megan, a fellow from Florida. What were some of the challenges you ran into as you were doing your research and you would find maybe gaps where you just cannot find the answer, or perhaps, as a fiction writer, you can just fill in those gaps, but writing a biography or nonfiction, you can't. So what are some of the challenges that you may have run into in your research?
This whole book was a challenge. I mean, as I said to someone at lunch, this book was closest to Cleopatra in the sense of the number of things that are missing. And some of that is just as basic as who actually organized the destruction of the tea. From Adams's papers, we know that the actual number of people was probably about 40. This is like, a generation or two later, everyone had helped destroy the tea, but it's really only it's like the French Resistance. Everybody was a member of the French Resistance afterward, but it's really only about 40 people. Who choreographed that? It was a military operation down to every precise detail. Who was the person who trained this? It may not have been Adams. It may have been any number of other people, but who was complicit in that? His emotional life. There are two wives. They're two very strong marriages. The second wife is very much an Abigail Adams character, extremely well educated, very much an equal partner with him. He's devoted to her. She talks politics with him. We have very little insight otherwise into that marriage. She brings up the children from the first wife. It's unusual in that day and age only to have had two children, so two surviving children. So what's the story there? I mean, there are so many gaps. The early years, I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem it from the book, but I had very little to go on. I mean, we know probably 4 facts of Samuel Adams's early life until the 1740s. And in the 1740s, the one thing we didn't talk about is another reason for that Harvard thesis is the family goes bankrupt. And that clearly changes everything for him. It may explain the Harvard MA thesis, but we don't have his reaction to, the family loses their fortune in what's called the land bank fiasco. And the collapse of the land bank is something he only once mentions later, much, much later. Everyone else talks about constantly. I would argue that his silence on that subject probably tells us something. But I'm arguing from a silence, so I can't really make much of that. So there were so many mysteries like that. I mean, he's very hard to read. The cards are close to the chest. You're getting a lot from his enemies. And in that way, this book resembled Cleopatra, where I was having to read what her opponent said about her and infer what the truth might be. In this case, a lot of the material, because he doesn't claim credit for his misdeeds. Obviously, it's too dangerous to do so. But when the governor or the lieutenant governor or the customs officials say this was Samuel Adams's work and here's what he said, then that's obviously the way you're going to find out where he was that night. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Justin Jones. I'm a high school history teacher from Concord, North Carolina, the fellow from North Carolina. The James Madison Fellowship is here for middle school and high school teachers of social studies government. But what can Sam Adams give us that we can give to our students that could help them understand the world that they are walking into?
I guess off the top of my head, I would say 2 things. One is that there is a clarity of expression here, which is it's such a gift, and he makes of it such an effective tool that it's thrilling. And I think that's teachable, right? I mean, I think some of us learn that, some of us learned it less well, some of us can figure it out as we go, but I think it's an invaluable tool, as is the solidarity, the team building that he puts into this, it's always to his mind. It's not one person's work. In that sense, I guess the title is a misnomer. It's really an effective coalition. And, you know, I think both in terms of learning and in terms of the profusion of ideals, that's immensely important.
Hi, my name is Marcus McGuinn from Missouri. As students, our professors have really encouraged us to meet these men and women from history on their own terms, in their own times, learning about them. As teachers, to reach the needs of all of our students, sometimes generalizations must be made. Can you speak to like one generalization or stereotype of the people from the founding that maybe Americans get right, but then maybe one stereotype or generalization of people from the founding that we get wrong?
Oh, I'm going to call in a lifeline here. Jeff, what do you... Come on, you've been teaching these years more. I don't have to teach.
Well, I'm reminded of Woody Allen, who said, if I can't give you a positive, can I give you 2 negatives? Well, one of the negatives is, one of the things we get wrong is that because we know a lot about 6 founders, therefore we know everything there is to know about all of the founders. So it's a book like this that pushes back against that, I think, profoundly unhelpful presumption that we know what the founders thought about X or Y, what their beliefs were. So there's one thing, I think, that is a generality that is just wrong.
And since we're going to do 2 negatives, can I add to that, that there's not a uniformity of sentiment among the founders. And as much as I say Samuel Adams brings people onto the same page and that they're the similar vocabulary and similar ideas, people are starting from very different spots. People come together for a fairly short period of time, and then people diverge fairly wildly. And if you actually look at this, the number of founders who fall out with each other after the revolution is not a particularly a happy spectacle, right?
Yes. And if I may say one other thing, I've already complimented this book and its author on the deftness with which religion is handled. There are, I think, too many generalities about the religion of the founders that are simply false. And this came up, in fact, in a discussion section yesterday, that they were all deists, for example. The tired and tiresome image of a watchmaker god, I think, is just completely inapplicable to the American Enlightenment founders. We were discussing Franklin earlier today, you and I. He is a theist. He believes in an interventionist God, I think. Certainly Jefferson does. So there is a generality that I think needs to be nuanced. As you were mentioning, there's a diversity among the thought of the founders with respect to religion. And so that's one generality that I think needs to be corrected, and we need to stop saying that the founders were all deists, and they all believed in a watchmaker god who made the world in the way that a watchmaker makes a watch, and then infused energy in the way that a watchmaker winds the mainspring of the watch, and then took the key out, and then let the thing run on its own. Even the most heterodox of the founders, Jefferson, Franklin, did not believe anything approaching that with respect to the deity.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Smith from Kentucky. Thanks for coming out today. You mentioned earlier about Franklin and sort of this moment that he transitions to a revolutionary. What would you suggest is the moment that Samuel Adams makes that change from king to tyrant?
You just asked the one question I should have answered when we talked about the title. So thank you for asking that. The suggested wisdom has always been that in the fall of 1768, when those first troops landed in Boston, Samuel Adams says, "I am on the side of independence." That is the turning point for him. I don't see anything on the page that indicates that actually happened. I mean, it makes sense, but there's nothing certainly that he writes or that is even written about him. Before the revolution begins, after the Boston Tea Party, Thomas Hutchinson will go back to London, will meet with the king, and will specifically say that Samuel Adams was the first person to advocate for independence. So we know he was out in front. And there are a number of informers whose material you can read today in the British archives, who talk about Samuel Adams standing on a street corner in Boston and basically saying, down with the king, up with independence. Those all sound to me like they're totally manufactured remarks which were being done for the sake of being paid as an informer. So they ring pretty hollow to me. My guess is that it is early 1770s, certainly. His feeling is that independence should have been declared the morning after Lexington and Concord. He cannot, for the life of him, figure out why it takes so long between those battles and the Declaration. He's beside himself with impatience in those years. But my best guess is that it's actually early 1770s. I mean, certainly the Boston Massacre would have been the dividing line. It's impossible to say, and there again, the material is really faulty.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Thomas from Kansas. So you saying propaganda earlier makes it easier for me to ask this question. Are there lessons that you think we could learn today as modern consumers of media from this revolutionary era producer of media? That's
a great question. There's an enormous amount of fake news in what Samuel Adams uses to promote the American Revolution. So, and it's used for a noble cause, and it's used very effectively. But it is, in fact, utterly manufactured news. So yes, there's certainly a lesson in that. The speed with which ideas change, and this is something that John Adams writes about, the speed with which the hearts and minds of Americans change between 1760, even 1765 and 1776 is extraordinary. And so, I mean, and that is purely due to this tremendously effective incendiary use of propaganda. So, I mean, those are two lessons to be used in whichever way we might want to pay attention to them. But newspapers obviously are the Bible of the day. Everyone in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts literacy rate is extremely high. Most everyone is reading the papers. They're handed from one person to the next. So you've got an extremely well-informed populace, which is one of the reasons why Massachusetts is such a restive colony. And that adds to the combustive nature of things in the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Thank you.
Well, that is perfect timing, actually. And I hope you will join me. This group has to head off to the Supreme Court.
I hear you have an important date.
And so I hope you will join me in thanking Stacy Schiff for her grace and her generosity.